Today is a very special day because I'm reviewing a toilet that most people probably don't even know exists. This is the Crane Sanwall toilet, not Sanwalton, Sanwall. Made around the early 1900s and made up until the 1930s, where it would be replaced by the Sanwalton in the late 1930s. This is definitely a fascinating design and probably one of the coolest toilets that most people don't even find anymore. I mean, this toilet is ancient and most of these probably don't even exist anymore, just a small handful. So let's take a look at this classic beauty and see what it offers. The overall design is pretty standard of most early 1900s toilet, rounded base, but very classy. As you can see, it is a back outlet or rear outlet toilet. And here is a trapway opening. Very strange design. It almost looks like a satin in a way, but like a earlier design. Let's have a look at a flush of one of these. Pretty standard straight down flush, but on a longer flush and better pressure, this thing can have a pretty good flush. The pulling factor definitely seems to be the strongest part, as this is a straight down flushing toilet, which is to be expected. It has frangents to help aid it, very similar to something like the Crane Sanwall. So it has a pretty good pull. Performance definitely looks fascinating. It looks like it performs pretty well overall, though probably not too top tier. That opening definitely is a very strange shape and a strange size, but it looks like it performs pretty well, especially for an old toilet like this. But it ain't satin levels, I promise you that. And as expected, ball rinse. Definitely not the strongest. Straight down jets, pet peeve of mine, so ball rinse really isn't too great, which is not really surprising, honestly. And that's all there is to this fascinating Crane Sanwall toilet, a toilet that most of you probably never heard of before. This is definitely a fascinating introduction to a back outlet toilet that would later be the Sanwalton once this gets discontinued. A pretty neat toilet that most people probably won't find anymore, but let's grade it. You know, for a early 1900s toilet, I definitely think the design is kind of bland. Outside the extended lip and the rounded base that most toilets had during the timeline, everything else just looks kind of plain. That doesn't prevent it from getting a 6, but it definitely could have scored a lot higher, but let's be honest, the design really isn't much special, even for its time. Quality control seems to be perfectly fine, with maybe my only gripes being the back rim jets being a little bit wonky, but outside of that, it actually seems to function fairly well and doesn't seem to have much problems outside of some of the standard stuff like the straight down ramjets, but we'll get to that later when we cover ball rinse. Overall, I'd give the quality control a 7. Now, it's really harsh to judge consistency based on just only free toilets that exist on YouTube, but from these particular 3, it seems like the consistency is pretty consistent, with maybe some slight defects every now and then if I had to guess, but outside of that, I give it an 8. The trapway seems to be perfectly fine. It isn't like you can really make it out anyway, but I could tell despite maybe slightly the opening looking a little bit questionable, and it's actually a lot larger than you might think, which is a good sign, so I'd give it a 7. The flush is not bad at all. Now, this particular one seems to be a little bit more weaker, and due to the water usage, it's not at its fullest potential. Although I would guess that on higher pressure and a longer flush, this thing could flush pretty good like the Crane Sands. But minus that, I noticed the flush is a little bit more choppier compared to the Sands. Well, at least from what I've experienced. Outside of that, I give it a 7. Pulling factor on this particular one seems okay, though I can definitely tell on higher pressure, same with the flush, I could tell the pulling factor could be pretty good. But due to the circumstances and some kind of nuance, again, the most I have to give it is a 7. I could see this at its fullest potential, but these particular 3 are not really it for really judging it, so I have to go on nuance here. It's not really what I want to do, but for something this rare, it'll have to do. I can definitely tell these can perform pretty good. They don't look like it due to the trapway opening at first, but once you realize how large the trapway is, these things can be pretty hard to clog. Unstoppable? Maybe not. I definitely think the Crane Sanwalton is a lot better performing compared to this, but from what I can tell, the performance definitely seems to be pretty good, and I give it an 8. And just like the third generation Crane Sanwalton toilet, the ball rinse is easily the worst part. It's not the worst ball rinse I've ever seen, but it's not necessarily great either. It has straight down jets, which, big shock, is my big pet peeve, and therefore ends up mixing some parts of the bowl, leading to some pretty questionable ball rinse. Definitely the weakest part of this toilet, and I give it a 5. Despite the extreme rarity of these things, I can definitely tell they can last a fairly good long time. Very good performers and very reliable in right circumstances would definitely give these things an 8. Now let's talk about the overall value of these particular toilets. These things are some interesting novelties of the early 1900s, and from what I've gathered from these particular toilets, they seem to be pretty reliable. Reasonable pulling factor and flush, good performance, and a really cool novelty to boot. I will say the ball rinse is definitely the weakest part of this toilet, but outside of that, these seem to be really good toilets, and it's a shame that they're pretty rare. Definitely a pretty interesting novelty with some slight drawbacks, and I will admit the design is a little bit lacking. But outside of that, these are definitely interesting once-in-a-lifetime toilets. Overall, I give it a 7 in value. The final score of the Crane Sanwall toilet from the early 1900s is a 70 out of 100. These are definitely some very unique novelties from the early 1900s. Seeing a back outlet toilet like this is very cool, and these would pave the way to what the Crane Sanwalton would eventually be once it got introduced in the 1930s. I'm interested to see how these compare to the Sanwalton, when I eventually review them, that is. But we'll have to wait and see.